Hi, I'm Dan, and in this video I'm going to go through the process of installing BookStack on Debian 12. Okay, I'll quickly take you through the steps that I've done ahead of time here. So one thing that I've done is that I've created a VPS instance, or a DigitalOcean droplet in this case. Of course, this could be any server that you might have, but one thing to note is that this does give me a public IP address, which I will be using for the setup of HTTPS towards the end of the guide. You could still follow this guide if you didn't have a public IP address, but you might not just be able to follow that part of the guide, at least in the way that I take you through the steps. And then I've also, on my domain bookstackapp.com, I've set up debian.bookstackapp.com to point to the IP address of that VPS instance, because I will be creating this as if I wanted it on that hostname debian.bookstackapp.com. So jumping over to the BookStack documentation, there's no official guide for Debian, but I'm going to take you through the general manual install steps, and we'll follow this as a kind of brief outline of what to do. So I'm going to split my window in two so that we can have the installation guide on the right hand side here, and within this terminal window I'm already logged into my Debian instance as the root user. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to be running through these commands as that root user, so I have full privileges in this instance. If you're not running as the root user, you might need to prefix all the commands that I write with sudo, or instead you could promote yourself to the root user using the su command. But just keep that in mind. If you come against anything that says you don't have permission to run the command, it's probably because I'm running these as the root user. Alright, so before we actually follow the installation instructions, we first need to make sure we've got the requirements for BookStack. So I'm going to scroll up to the requirements section of the documentation, and then we can install all of these using the Debian Package Manager apt. But first of all, I'm going to do an apt update just to update the repositories. So with that done, I'll clear the screen. And now I'll probably go through and install all of this almost in one go, at least most of these requirements. So it will be apt install. Now first we need to install PHP, and I'm not exactly sure what version Debian has. But what I'll do, I'll put PHP 8 dot and then see what pops up. So I'll press tab there and it auto-completed to 2. So it looks like Debian's using PHP 8.2, which meets our requirements here. If you're watching this video long after it's been posted, you might need to get your PHP via a different alternative repository if BookStack's already moved across and maybe made 8.3 the minimum, for example. But we've got 8.2 there, and that should be good for another couple of years yet. So we'll go for that. And then we're going to need the extensions as well. So I'm going to do PHP 8.2 hyphen, and then I'm going to use some bash syntax here. I'm going to use curly braces so I can list out all of these in one go. So now I'm going to put curl gd mb string bc math, math, mysql, xml, zip, and I think that should probably do it. But if we don't have any of the extensions, we should be warned about that later on. But next up, there's going to be the database that we need to install. Now, Debian has MariaDB in its repository, so I think we could do MariaDB-server. Yep, that tab auto-completed. And then we're going to need Git, so I'll tack on Git into here as well. And then Composer, I'm going to not get that from the Debian repositories. We'll fetch that via the official means, which allows it to be updated a bit easier. And then a PHP-compatible web server, which we're going to do Apache. And it looks like it's just Apache 2. Sorry, I spammed tab there to see what it auto-completed as, which is why we've got all these lines, but we've still got our command written out here. So I think that should be everything. So if I hit enter, see what pops up. It's going to say it's installing all of this stuff. That looks good to me. So I'll type in Y for yes and press enter. And it's going to go ahead, fetch all those packages and install them all. Okay, that's all installed. We can do a php-v, just make sure we've got PHP there. And then, yep, it reports back PHP 8.2.7. Might be a slightly different version for you if you're following this later, but at least we know it's installed. So, yeah, we skipped over Composer. So let's go to the Composer website. I'll open that in a new tab. I'll click download. And they've got some commands up here. So I'm going to copy these and paste them into the terminal. Okay, and then I'm also going to come down to here and then copy this one as well. And again, I don't need the sudo part, but you might need to have that if you're not running as root. I'm going to copy that, paste that in, and then this moves it into a location that's globally available on the command line. And that way, because by default it says to use php composer.var, But this allows you to just run composer like that, and we'll do a -big-V to check the version. It's going to complain because I'm running as root, but that's fine in this case because I am running as the root user and that's expected. And it is safer not to run composer as the root user, which is why it's complaining. But it's not like I've got anything else on this machine that could potentially be affected by other security edge cases. So for me, I'm just going to press yes to all this. Yeah, we've got composer 2.5.8 in this case. Again, you might have a different version there. All right, so now I'm going to go down to the manual installation steps and we'll go from here. So we need to clone down the release branch of the GitHub repository into a folder. So we need to think about where we actually want this. So I'm going to put it in var dub. So if we cd to var/dub, and then let's have a look at what we've got in here at the moment. We've just got a HTML folder, which actually, since we've installed Apache, if we go to debian.bookstackapp.com, we're going to see the default Apache 2 Debian page, which is going to be within the HTML folder. So we know Debian's running, but we're going to go for a different folder. So within here, I'm going to make directory BookStack. Then I'm going to copy this. And then still on var www, I'm going to paste this in, and then on the end, write BookStack to say, put this repository into the BookStack folder. Okay, so that's pulled down the code. Now we can go into that folder. And then I'm going to run composer install just node dev, which is step 2 here. And again, press yes to that. And if we had missed any of the PHP extensions, we should be warned at this point. But it looks like we got everything that was needed, so we should be good to go in that regard. Now we need to copy the .env.example file to an env file. Copy.env.example.env, and then let's use nano to edit that. So we'll come back to the app key in a minute because that's a later step. Now we need to alter the app URL. Basically, what is the URL that we're going to expect to use to access BookStack on? And as I said earlier, for us, it's debian.bookstackapp.com. And I'm going to switch that to HTTP for now because I'm going to set it up on HTTP and then we'll switch to HTTPS later. And if you're just using an IP address, you'll just do again HTTP and then your IP address after that. Then we're going to need some database details. So we've installed the database, but we haven't set up a database instance or a user or anything like that. So we'll do that and then we'll come back to this file. So I'm going to save this using Control-O to write that, Control-X to exit. And now let's do that database stuff. So we can do that by doing MySQL, we'll go -u for user and then the root user. And again, you might need to run that as the root user as well, because sometimes the root MySQL user is locked to the root user of the machine that you're running. I'll hit enter there and we should access the database like we have done there. And now let's create a database. We'll do create database BookStack. Whoops, one extra O. So that's created, and we'll do create user, and I also call that BookStack at local host identified by, and then some quotes, and then I'll finish this off with a semicolon. But in the quotes, we're going to need to put in a password for this database user. So I usually generate a random password, so you can do this in any old password generator. I'm going to use pwgen. And then let's go for this one. And then I'm going to paste that in there. So we created the database, we created the user. Now we need to give permissions for the user to be able to use that database instance. So then we'll do grant all privileges on BookStack, that's the database name, .star, so all tables, to BookStack, the user at localhost. So that's permissions given to the database user, and they will need all permissions because the database structure and everything like that is handled by BookStack. So we've given it all permissions to that particular database, and now we need to just, to make sure those permissions are in play, we'll do flush privileges. Or I can't spell today. Privileges. There we go. Now we could exit with Control D, or we can type exit, semicolon, and now we're out of the database. So we need to use these details back in our .env file. So make sure you've got that password that you use noted. Again, we can use nano.env, and it'll come down here. And localhost, the DB host, because it's on the same machine, so we'll keep that as localhost. The DB database, we called that BookStack, and then we also called the username BookStack. and then we'll paste in that password for the DB password option, and that's all we need to change for now. If you need to have email available, which is currently used for like password resets and mainly user account stuff, but content notifications are probably coming to BookStack in the future, then you might want to configure these mail details as well at some point. You could do this later on, but these are the options that you'll need to change to make sure your instance can send email. So this would often be an SMTP server that you already have. So you can use stuff like your Gmail or your Outlook account in a lot of cases. Or for a more proper enterprise setup, you might have a specific SMTP server. But I'm going to ignore that for now because it's not needed for the initial setup at least. Now I'm going to save this file again, Control-O, Control-X to exit. So that was step 3. Now step 4, ensure the storage of the Bootstrap cache folder and the public uploads folders are writable by the web server. So currently that's probably not the case. If I do ls-alh storage, just to list out that folder with its permissions, we can see there's all owned by the user that I'm currently running as, the root user. And the root user has write permissions, but the group and everyone else doesn't have access to write to this directory. And Apache on Debian based instances, it's going to be running as www-data. That's the username. So we need to make sure that user, or at least that group, has permission to write to the required folders listed there. What we can do, we can follow this link, the more information here, and this has got an example permission set up. So there's a bunch of example commands here. We just need to change out a few parts. So one of those is your normal login user that you might want to run updates as. For us, I'm going to keep that to root because I'm running as the root user. Our BookStack install folder. So in this example, it uses var www.bookstack, which is what we're using here, so we don't have to change that. And your web server or PHP user, which, as I just mentioned, this is correct for us, www-data. So I'm generally going to follow these commands. So we'll do pound for change owner, recursively for everything, and I'm going to do root as the user that owns all of this, and www data as the group that owns all of this, and I'm going to apply that to the var www bookstack directory. And then the next command, chmod -r to make it recursive, and 755 so that the user can write and read and execute everything. Then the group and everyone else can just read and execute everything else. They don't have permission to write, and we'll apply that to the same directory, var www bookstack. And then I'm going to copy this one in because it's quite long. But this applies the permissions to all those directories that were specified within that step. And this is much like the previous step where it was doing chmod, but this is setting the group to have write access to those specific locations within your BookStack installation. And then this last one is quite a good idea as well. It's not really needed, but I'm going to run that. And this sets the .env file, the file that had all the settings, like the database settings, to be write and readable by the user, which is going to be the root user in this case, and then only readable by the group user, so it's readable by the web server user, and then it's not visible, or it's not readable at least, to everyone else. Just because sometimes within this file, like we had the database password, you can have other credentials as well. It's often a nice idea, just as a layer of security, just to make sure that's not visible to any other user accounts on the system. All right, that's the permission step done. Now we're on to step 5 in the application root. So this is your BookStack installation folder, which for us, we're already in, var www bookstack, run php artisan key generate. So I'm just going to copy that and paste that in. So do we really want to run this? And this isn't something you ever want to run again, hence why this warning pops up. But for the first time kind of install, this is fine to run. And this sets a key within the .env file. So if I go nano.env again, and then this sets this key now, which wasn't set before. And this is used for things like encryption within the system. So step 6 is if you're not using Apache or if htaccess files are disabled, you have to create some URL rewrite rules as shown below. So we are using Apache, but I'm going to purposely set up an Apache configuration just because we still need to tell Apache about where BookStack exists, and we haven't done that yet. And also htaccess files can be a bit of a security concern, so I want to do things the more recommended way, which is do everything via the configuration file. So let's do that now, and we can use this web server configuration section. Down here is example Apache virtual host configuration. We can use this as a basis. So I'll open up in a new tab. So I'm going to copy that, and then back in our terminal window, I'm going to change to a different location. I'm going to cd to /etc Apache2 sites available. Then within here, if we go ls, there's already going to be a couple in there for the default site, and that's the default Apache page that we saw earlier. I'm going to create a new config via nano, and then we'll do bookstack.conf. Hit enter to create this file, and I'll paste in that content that I just copied, and then I'll go right to the top and we'll just go down this and change what's needed. So the first up is server name. So we need to change this for the domain name that we're using, or maybe you can put an IP address in here. But in our case, it was debian.bookstackapp.com. And then document root. This needs to point to the public folder of your Bookstack instance. So this is correct for us, because var www bookstack and the public folder within our instance. And that's the same here as well. So we don't need to change that, that's all good. And then we just double check everything else. But this all looks okay, so that should be it in terms of changes there. Again, Control O to write that out, enter, and Control X. So that's the config created, but now we need to enable that, which we can do with A2, en, and then site. And we'll go bookstack.conf. So it's enabling site bookstack, and then it advises we need to run this to take into account our configuration changes. So we'll run that as well. So that's the Apache config setup. If we go back over to installation steps and find out where we were, so that was step 6. So that config had those rewrite rules that this step mentions. And then by doing that, we've also done step 7 to set the web root to the public folder. All right, so now we need to run php artisan migrate to update the database, but currently we're not in the right directory. So we'll change back to the Bookstack directory at var www and bookstack, and now we can run this command. So php artisan migrate. Again, scary prompt just to make sure we are intending to make changes. And now we can see this is all running. When you get logs like this, we've done, that's a good sign. And that has applied all the required database changes, and we've got to the end of that. It's at this point, if you've done any of the database details wrong, if there's like differences in your .env file to what you've set up when you're doing the database MySQL steps, then you'd probably get an error at that stage, like where it couldn't connect, or maybe it didn't have permission. That's when you'd find out. But because that ran okay, that means our details were all correct and what we done was okay. Back over to the installation, step 9. All right, we're done. Should be able to access the admin details of admin@admin.com and the password of password. We should change these immediately. So I'll jump back over to that tab where we had debian.bookstackapp.com open. We'll reload this and see what happens. Okay, looks like nothing happens. Nope, it's on the default page, so I've made a mistake somewhere. Give me a moment and I'll find out where I've made that mistake. Okay, I fixed that particular issue where we were seeing the default Debian Apache content, and that's because the default config was still active, and that was taking precedence over our added Bookstack config, which I had assumed would take precedence because it had a name defined, but apparently that wasn't the case. So to address that, I just had to run the command a2 dis site 000-default.conf, and when I say 0, I do mean 0. And then after that, because there's a config change, you need to do systemctl reload apache 2. So that's that issue dealt with, but what we might now see is this. Now it might look like that we're no further, but we are, because we came to debian.bookstackapp.com/login, and that /login shows that the app is being requested and is redirecting to login. So it's kind of working, but as soon as it goes to /login, then it's failing. We can see that if I just remove that, there we go, it took us back to /login. So if you have a case like this, it usually means that the URL rewriting stuff isn't working, so it's likely that module just needs to be enabled, which we can do via a2 enmod rewrite. And then again, I'll press up a couple of times to rerun the systemctl reload apache 2. So if we reload now, hey, we now see a Bookstack looking screen. That's pretty cool. Let's log in. So go admin@admin.com, password. And it looks like we're into the system. So if I just widen this, and I'm just going to test a few things. So I'll create a new book. I'll create a new page. And I'm going to upload an image just to make sure the image and file uploading is working okay with this system. There we go, I've uploaded 5 different images, and let's put one into the document to make sure that's working okay. And as it previously advised, now would be the point to edit your username or your email address and password by going up here, then edit profile, and then change your email here, your name if you wish, and then set a password that's not the default one. Right, so we've got a working Bookstack instance. but it's not on HTTPS because we've got the old unsecure padlock up here. So let's get this onto HTTPS, and we'll do this using Let's Encrypt and Certbot. So I'm going to widen the terminal side of things because we're going to be doing a lot more terminal work. So as I said, we'll use Certbot to fetch and install our certificate. So I'm going to install Certbot via the Debian repositories. If you go to the Certbot website, then their process would advise you to install it via snap packages. And personally, I'm not too fond of snap packages, especially on Debian where they're not existing by default. So I'm going to use the Debian version of Certbot. But if you have issues with that route, maybe you could try following the Certbot instructions. It generally shouldn't be, but sometimes if there's been changes, the Debian version can sometimes be a little bit more out of date. But yeah, I'm going to do apt install Certbot. And it's making some suggestions here that I've just noticed, including Python, Certbot, Apache. So I'm going to copy that, because I'm also going to want to install that afterwards. So I'm going to press yes to this to let us continue. But now I'm going to install that package that I just copied. So apt install, and I'll paste that Python 3-Certbot-Apache, and I'll press yes to that. And this package should allow Certbot to do a lot of the Apache specific stuff for us. So with that installed, we can now run Certbot. And it's going to say enter an email address. So I'll do dan@bookstackapp.com. Do I agree to the terms and conditions? I've read them all, so I'm going to say yes. And we'd like to get updates from the EFF. I'm going to say no because I've already said yes in the past. And that's going to ask what domains do we want to set up HTTPS for. So we've only got the one, and in my case debian.bookstackapp.com, so I'm going to go with that. And now that has succeeded. So it says successfully received certificate, it's saved there, expires on there, and it says Certbot has set up a scheduled task to automatically renew this certificate in the background. So we shouldn't have to worry about renewals. But certificates from Let's Encrypt, via Certbot in this case, typically last about 90 days. So we can see here this certificate expires in October the 21st, and it's July now. So you might want to put something in the diary on that date just in case it doesn't renew. And then if your website stops having HTTPS, after that date or on that date, then you know you probably need to manually run Certbot renew and or debug what's going on and why it isn't renewing things. But from experience, that should generally work fine. It's also said it's added a HTTP to HTTPS rewrite in addition to my other rewrite rules. So that's pretty useful. It's created a new version of the Apache config that we set up. So BookStack LE for Let's Encrypt -SSL. And it says we've enabled HTTPS. So let's reload this and see what happens. So yeah, it's not automatically redirecting this like this said it kind of set up. And that's because the added rewrite rules don't really work with the existing ones. But we can actually just go to HTTPS, manually put that in the browser. And there we go. We're on HTTPS debian.bookstackapp.com now. But you might have noticed that something looks a little fishy. This doesn't look the same as it did before. We've got big giant icons there. And that's fine. We just need to adjust our configuration a little bit for BookStack. So we're in the BookStack directory. And we're going to edit our .env file like we did earlier, do nano.env. And then if you remember, we set this app URL. I'm going to go down to that, and we started that with HTTP. If we add an S in there, and I'll save this and quit, and I'll reload the page. Hey, that's looking a bit better. We've got the full lock now. And obviously we haven't got those giant icons, and everything kind of looks as we expected. Now I'm going to go into that page that we created earlier, and that's still loading fine. The image loads, but you'll notice we did get a little warning icon on the lock symbol, and that's because the image itself is still loading in via HTTP. And this is because we created content when it wasn't HTTPS, and then we changed to HTTPS. If you go to HTTPS right away, you should be absolutely fine from now on. But because we had pre-existing content, we also need to update that content. It's kind of like in the BookStack database to also be on HTTPS. So it's just one more step for us in that case. I'm going to go back to the BookStack documentation. I'm going to expand this to be half and half again. And I'm going to go to the commands page of our documentation. And then there's a command update system URL. I'm going to click on that. And that'll take us to this section. And we can use this command to update from one URL to another. This can also be used if you're changing your instance. Say if I didn't want debian.bookstackapp.com, I wanted myawesomedocs.bookstackapp.com. I could use this to migrate my content over. But we're going to use this for the HTTPS stuff. So I'm going to copy out the start of that, and I'll make the terminal big again. Paste this in. So it's the old URL first, and then the new URL, and there's a little example here. So for us, it was HTTP debian.bookstackapp.com, and then the new URL is HTTPS debian.bookstackapp.com. And I'm going to hit enter. It says it's going to search for that. We'll just double check that's good. HTTP, debian.bookstackapp.com, and it's going to replace it with HTTPS, debian.bookstackapp.com. We want to proceed. That's what it essentially does. It does like a find and replace across many important columns within the database. So it's quite simplistic, but we need to make sure it's correct, which it does look like that. In our case, yes. And it's going to confirm again. It's going to ask us, have we made a backup? You know, if you're running this later with an instance with loads of content, then you probably want to make sure you've got a backup. But, you know, I'm going to lie here because we've just set it up. I don't really care about the content that's in there. Press yes. Cool. So it made a few updates to images and page content. If I go back over there, I'll refresh the page. Cool. And now we've got the full log. There's no more warning sign because the image is fully loading over HTTPS. And that's pretty much the process. We've now got a working BookStack set up on Debian 12 with HTTPS. So if you're following along and have any issues, feel free to give us a shout in the comments below or via our Discord server. But otherwise, I hope that you have a successful journey in setting up your instance and have a wonderful day.